Let me begin this way. As a little girl, I loved to play house. I had a walk-in closet, and I set it up as a cozy cottage for my stuffed animals. I was their mother. By some genetic fluke, they were all of different species, bears, monkeys, dogs. I tended to them, I nurtured them. I would feed them, cuddle with them, and I also taught them. I set up a little classroom in our cottage. They never fared very well in their studies. I'm not sure if that was my poor teaching or if the lack of a brain was an insuperable obstacle to learning. But I persevered in my mothering and my teaching. I look back on that little scene with great fondness. I was a little girl wanting to love. I wanted to care for another, to make a home. In that little cottage, a desire was being expressed that the church would put in Gaudium et Spes as the desire to make a sincere gift of self. JP2 elaborated upon this concept in a most compelling way. I find that phrase so beautiful. The kind of ontological background for this is that human beings are called to love. We're the kind of creature called to love. As I now understand my childhood and my adolescence, though I don't like to remember my adolescence very much, my childhood attachments and affections and even my young adult attachments and affections were an expression of this desire, the desire to make a sincere gift of self and to receive that gift from someone else, to form, again in the language of the church, a communion of persons. I have found this in marriage, a true experience of this reality. My husband and I share a unity of purpose. We have a pledge of fidelity, care, goodwill, which is a source of tremendous joy. Marriage has also entailed a painful growth in maturity. But because of the vow, our home is a safe and I would say a healing place. And I would love to confer with Dr. Laracy about the healing dimensions of marriage. We are for each other. My husband and I are for each other forever, and we know that. Having exchanged with my husband this mutual gift of self, I was in a place to make an even more radical gift of self, motherhood. Motherhood is an indescribable privilege. First, you nurture new life in your own body, in your innermost place. You are a sanctuary. You protect and nurture and nourish a person. Then you welcome this child into the world. I would commend to you the writings of a very profound Swiss theologian of the last century, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who talks about the importance of the mother's smile. That when a mother cradles her infant, let's say newborn, and I remember doing this so well with my children, it's so profound. The mother is communicating to the child that he is good. And he recognizes existentially and immediately that he is a different person. He's a separate self. And by virtue of her smile, his own goodness is affirmed. Moreover, the mother's smile, think of the mother cradling her baby in her arms. He learns that the world is good, the world is safe, it's hospitable. This is at a profound ontological and existential level. And it's the foundation of home. The mother is the animating center of the home. The privilege of being a wife and mother takes its shape there in building the culture of the home. Not only do we welcome the child into the world, but we also have the great task of forming that child. As JP2 puts it, parents are the first heralds of the gospel for their children. They communicate the faith to them by word and deed. And the gift of self that we mentioned earlier is expressed daily through daily acts of service, courtesy, sacrifice, sometimes heroic sacrifice, prayer, catechesis, religious observance. Home can be the center of Catholic culture. And the joys of motherhood found therein are incomparable. I was a university professor for 15 years. And then when we had our third child, and I had this intimation even with our first, I realized my children need me. They need me to be there. And what came as a surprise to me was that I also needed them. I needed to be there, to be part of the rhythm of their day. I have not had a single second thought, honestly, in 6 years. And I was tenured. I was an associate professor. I was teaching in the law school and undergrads as well. My decision to come home has been so profoundly gratifying. I haven't regretted it for a single moment. Why? In part because our home life, and I'll talk about the challenges of our home life in a moment, our home life is rich. It's full of celebration, probably too much. We try to cultivate a liturgical rhythm. We have meals together every day. We have a lot of conversation. In fact, my oldest child can talk a blue streak. There's music. Everyone's playing an instrument. And not only because we're homeschooling, I think I would commend this to all of us here, our home attempts to be a place of learning. The home can be a center of learning, not the University of Paris in the 13th century, but a place where the love of the world is cultivated by learning about the world, where the great Catholic heritage is transmitted, and children are initiated into what Charlotte Mason calls a great tradition. Stories are recounted, myths and heroic tales are read, nature lore is savored, hands are employed in art and handicrafts, beautiful music is enjoyed, instruments are played, guests are welcome, and the art of conversation is cultivated. It's in the home where you become fully human, fully alive, and the mother makes this possible. So you have rhythm versus chaos, you have a routine, you have a reasonable amount of tidiness that allows every member of the household the space and the freedom to wonder, why is it that, or how does this work? Or, Mom, what kind of a bird is that? Your home is filled with things that, in the words of Anne Shirley, one of my great heroines in literature, gives scope for the imagination. Your home is a place where there are books, lots of them, beautiful books, art, music, a table setting. When you sit down to dinner, you have a candle and you have some beautiful music playing in the background. So your home is a place of order and wonder, and this yields joy. I might say, just by way of a footnote, and we can talk about this during the discussion, we don't have a television, we don't have video games, and we don't even have a smartphone. And I would say that the fact that we don't have the dominance of screens in our household gives the household a measure of peace and depth and the capacity to wonder, and also fosters the habits of attention, observation, and presence. We can talk about that a little bit more. And if I may, I'm mindful of the time here. If I could give a bit of advice that might sound radical, though I think it's reasonable and I'd be prepared to make an argument for it. To prepare yourselves for motherhood, consider getting rid of your smartphones and getting rid of your televisions. I think there has not been a single technology that has done more to damage human community than the smartphone. And I realize that that's a radical claim. I'm prepared to defend it in a cordial way. The joy of motherhood and homemaking is profound. I came to discover when I retired from professional life, this is what I was made for. But it's also hard. Sleep deprivation, heavy carbs, original sin. It's a potent combination. At bottom, though, what makes it hard is that children are persons. They're not stuffed animals. And they're not replicas of ourselves. They've bodies and minds and spirits, and in our case, wills and temperaments all their own. They have a transcendent origin and destiny. While we mother them, they are not ours. We do not own them. They and we are sinners. And though we might have a glorious vision for home life, it may not be realized, or it may not be realized every day, or only fitfully and partially. So we have to correct and penalize and forgive our children. We have to teach them and guide them in what is right and wrong, and try to train in them good habits, leading them slowly, sometimes painfully, into a firmness of character that will allow them to thrive, as Aristotle would put it, to make them good people who do good actions. We also have to ask for their forgiveness, try to reform our habits. I'm 50 years old, and I still feel a resistance in myself to making my bed in the morning. That's pathetic. But I'm still doing it. I'm still cultivating it. We have to be the kind of people who can give a sincere gift of self to each other. And we have to rely on grace and mercy. And I would say the real assistance of the Blessed Mother. I never had a strong connection to Our Lady for a host of complicated reasons. But as a mother, I've come to appreciate her reality. She's really there, really able to help us. And to try again tomorrow. There was a refrigerator magnet that my friend and I in grad school had. I don't even remember who the author of this quotation was, but I found it touching, and it's come back to me. Courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is the small voice that says, I will try again tomorrow. Or to quote from Anne of Green Gables again, tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it, yet. To live maternity and marriage as a vocation is a call to joy. And the depth and breadth of this vocation is astonishing. This was recognized well by G.K. Chesterton last century when these tasks were beginning to be disparaged. Against the so-called progressives of his day who were critics of homemaking, Chesterton contends, and this is where I'll end, to be Queen Elizabeth within a definite area, deciding sales, banquets, labors, and holidays. To be Whiteley within a certain area, providing toys, boots, sheets, cakes, and books. To be Aristotle within a certain area, teaching morals, manners, theology, and hygiene. I can understand how this might exhaust the mind, but I cannot imagine how it could narrow it. How can it be a large career to tell other people's children about the rule of 3, and a small career to tell one's own children about the universe? How can it be broad to be the same thing to everyone, and narrow to be everything to someone? No, a woman's function is laborious because it is gigantic, not because it is minute. I will pity Mrs. Jones for the hugeness of her task. I will never pity her for its smallness. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be here, and a real striking experience to stand here and look out from this perspective on this beautiful group of women. I've been sitting among you these days, but to be able to see you from this perspective is a real joy. And it's a privilege to be able to be here with the others sharing their experiences of maternity. I also want to just say that it's a great joy to be here with so many of our religious sisters. This is always a joy when we're able to be together and get to know each other's communities and each other personally. So it's a wonderful experience. Today I'll speak briefly about the call to spiritual maternity and how religious women live and experience spiritual maternity. Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, in his apostolic exhortation, Vita Consecrata, on religious life, a tremendously rich document, said, "Virginal love is the source of a particular fruitfulness which fosters the birth and growth of divine life in people's hearts." His quote, "the birth and growth of divine life in people's hearts expresses the essence of spiritual maternity. As we discuss spiritual maternity, we again reference the wisdom of Pope St. John Paul II. He radically awakened the world to the beauty of our sexuality, the gift each person is given, whether married, singled, or consecrated religious. He wrote volumes on the mysteries revealed in the words in Genesis. Male and female, he created them. He masterfully articulated truths in his work, The Original Unity of Man and Woman, which became his profound gift to the world, Theology of the Body. In that context, we, as women, not only acknowledge, but we cherish the reality that I am a female body. Not I have a female body, I am a female body. What does this mean? Whichever state of life we are called to by God, we experience everything in and through our bodies, our female bodies. As women, we are all called to be mother. The fulfillment of our being woman is becoming mother, biologically and or spiritually. As women, our bodies are created to receive, conceive, birth, nurture, and ultimately to release into more new life. The archetype and exemplar of this is our Blessed Virgin Mother. She received the Holy Spirit, conceived Jesus in her womb, birthed him in Bethlehem, nursed and nourished him at her breast, and released him to his public ministry and ultimately to the cross. Again, Pope St. John Paul II. If the new motherhood conferred on Mary at Calvary is a gift for all Christians, it has a specific value for those who have completely consecrated their lives to Christ. Becoming mother is a process which takes us through the stages of virgin, bride, spouse, to mother. This is not a single one-time process. It is ongoing in a cycle which unfolds again and again, often simultaneously, from taking on minor events of everyday life to facing major life challenges. Our co-foundress, Mother Sean Vergowen, has developed and articulated this process beautifully. Here, we will just look briefly at what characterizes each stage. Virgin. There is a readiness to receive, a purity, an ungiven potential in this stage. Bride. We know here at this time of awaiting anticipation, incubating with an idea, a project, a relationship. Spouse. Here, there is a deepening and unwavering fidelity that holds us through challenging times of purification, as well as the joyous ones. Finally, mother. Physical consumption of the body for the good of the other, nurturing life with the instinct of protectiveness, yet always releasing life each step so that new life comes into its own. This is what every woman strives to do in her own unique God-given call. I can speak for myself and probably many other consecrated religious who presumed we would marry and have a huge family and live out our maternity in sacramental marriage. As is often the case, God had a different plan. And we express our fertility differently. And I am grateful for this call. So how do we as consecrated religious live this process? In speaking to consecrated men and women, Pope Francis said, maternity is not only to make children. Maternity is to accompany. Maternity is to spend hours at the side of a sick person, a sick child, a sick brother. It is to spend life in love, with a love of tenderness and maternity. As celibate sexual beings, we consecrated religious, in imitation of Christ, live a containment that generates a unique intensity that is different from others. In many ways, this process of bringing forth and nurturing life manifests clearly in our communities, especially as we care for our young members and those in our apostolates. Some concrete examples of how our community and other communities foster and bring forth life as we, in Pope Francis's words, lovingly accompany a young woman exploring a possible vocation to religious life, learning more about the call to consecrated life by talking with sisters and visiting our home. Accompanying a young sister as she grows through postulancy and novitiate and lives the joys and struggles of formation. Accompanying a client in therapy who feels unloved by spouse, family, God. A dying patient in hospice care who reconciles with his estranged family members and even desires to return to the sacraments left long ago. One of the most profound examples of spiritual maternity is the founding of a new religious community, the fruits of which we consecrated religious have been blessed to receive. In our brief time together, we have been blessed to see and experience spiritual maternity in innumerable ways. Each community has its own way of expressing maternity. What are some other ways? Our community expresses maternity in many ways. For example, like St. Francis rebuilding the church one stone at a time, we strive to rebuild the church one person at a time. Another way is to restore a sense of the sacred, especially the sacredness of human life, in a world that knows the rupture between the sacred and the secular. What does this mean in our daily lives? A specific example from our community experience. Last week, we honored a woman at an annual fundraiser. We had not met her before, so we invited her to meet us. We greeted her warmly, we affirmed her, we showed her our land, we took her to our chapel. That evening at the event, as she spoke before nearly 800 people to receive her award, she was nearly speechless. She clearly was diverging from her prepared remarks and related her childhood experiences of religion and her decision to leave the church. As she spontaneously spoke, reflecting on her experience of accompaniment, she shared that she had to rethink her long-standing decision about religion. Encounters such as this and the countless others in just a day exemplify new life conceived and brought forth for the life of the church by awakening others and evoking questions across the spectrum from those who have no conscious awareness of God in their lives to those grappling very intentionally with questions about call. All are searching, whether knowingly or not, for truth and realities beyond what they live in their daily lives. As religious, we are exhorted again by Pope St. John Paul II. You have the task of once more inviting men and women of our time to lift their eyes, not to let themselves be overwhelmed by everyday things, to let themselves be captivated by the fascination of God and His Son's gospel. In all that we do, we need to be a presence that can open others to the reality that they are called to holiness. Consecrated persons, another quote from Vita Consecrata, consecrated persons at the deepest level of their being are caught up in the dynamism of the church's life, which is thirsty for the divine absolute and called to holiness. It is to this holiness that they bear witness. As consecrated religious living the vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, we know the power of grace that takes us beyond our natural inclinations. In the words of my community's foundress, Mother Rose May Pender, the vow of chastity freely releases the human capacity of love in its fullness and is marked by aliveness and a spirit of joy. Today, our call as consecrated religious in the milieu of great disorder and confusion in which we live demands that we witness the beauty of women and embody the mystery of mother, imaging what awaits us beyond this world, foreshadowing the future kingdom. Again, as we heard at the outset, virginal love is the source of a particular fruitfulness which fosters the birth and growth of divine life in people's hearts. In conclusion, if we just pray a very brief excerpt from the Litany of our Blessed Virgin Mother, invoking her intercession in the mystery she embodies of virginal maternity. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us. Holy Virgin of Virgins, pray for us. Mother most pure, pray for us. Mother most chaste, pray for us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. I feel like I've learned so much myself already. I will affirm Dr. Schindler's advice, well, part of it at least. We got rid of our TV on October 22nd, and my husband and I describe it as the best parenting decision we've ever made. I'm not sure I'm there on the cell phone, but I'm convicted to at least talk to my husband about it. So I'm honored to be here with you to share some reflections on motherhood from the experience of infertility, a cross that my husband and I have carried for our almost 15 years of marriage. We'll celebrate our 15th wedding anniversary on Tuesday. We were married on, thank you. We were married on the Feast of the Sacred Heart in the Basilica of the Sacred Heart at Notre Dame, and so this morning's Mass was like a little anniversary present for me. So I'm excited to talk about our experience with infertility and also our vocation to adoption. And it's difficult to unpack either one of those topics in this short time, but if I had to, in one sentence or one sentiment, express to you what I want to try to get across, it's this, and that's that our crosses, whatever they may be, are not obstacles to our gifts. They're the way that our gifts bear fruit. So in what I'm about to recount, infertility was not an obstacle to the gift of motherhood or to the fruitfulness of our marriage. It was a form of suffering that, like all suffering, bears fruit. And adoption, which St. John Paul II has called an exchange of gifts, is a real way to experience motherhood. So my husband and I both come from families of 7, and while in our marriage prep, we discussed every possible thing you could consider as a possible challenge to your marriage, and we never considered, and nobody raised with us, the possibility of infertility. And yet, infertility, we should have considered it because it impacts, they say, 1 in 8 couples, and many more will experience related sufferings of secondary infertility, miscarriage, stillbirth. And there's much I could say about the particular experience of infertility. There are significant physiological, emotional, psychological, even social or financial aspects to the experience. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on a couple of aspects to me that were special features that I think we can all learn something from. First, because our bodies carry within them the potential for motherhood, infertility strikes to the very heart of your understanding and your embrace of your own femininity. Obviously, men also suffer from infertility, but since this is a panel on motherhood, I'm going to leave them to the side for a minute. But I also think infertility does play out on the woman in a particular way. So, for example, the absence of pregnancy or the inability to conceive never shows on a man in the way that it's repeatedly visited on the woman, right, whose belly is never swollen with new life. I think of the ubiquitous like baby bump watch that we, like the minute Prince Harry and Meghan get married, we're all like focused on her stomach to see whether or not, and I have to say, if you carry your weight in your middle, the focus on the baby bump is particularly horrifying. But the woman is like visibly not pregnant, right? And she's repeatedly reminded, because of our cycle, that she's yet, for another month, not pregnant. According to St. John Paul, the ability to conceive and bear children gives rise to woman's particular feminine genius, that our special ability to give and receive the human person in love. And he's careful to say that this is not limited to an exclusively biophysiological interpretation of women, but that physical capacity does reveal an important part of our dimension, which is motherhood. So to be unable to do that, so that your body's failing you, right? You feel like your body's this big failure. It's not just an emotional sadness, but it's a kind of fundamental anguish regarding your worth as a woman. Another particular way that I think infertility, and to be honest, fertility can have this effect too, that it can affect women in this way, that Pope John Paul said that women have to take care that our sensitivity to the other doesn't succumb to the temptation to possessive selfishness. And this tendency in the context of infertility can become a possessive desire to have children. And so you think of them as objects to which you're entitled instead of a gift, a unique other that you receive. And so that desire for children, even if you follow, check all the boxes on the church's teaching with respect to, infertility treatment and all that, that desire, as good as and as holy as it is, it can be the occasion of turning away from God because his will doesn't match our own. And I think assistive reproductive technologies, they just reinforce this natural good feeling and warp it. They make an idol of parenthood. They treat the man and woman as instruments toward the production of an object, which is the child. The child is not the gift of an embrace. Motherhood is not something received and given. It's something grasped at as an entitlement. The cross of infertility also strikes to the heart of married life. So because children are the visible sign of married love, right? They're literally the two made one. The very act, the conjugal act that's supposed to be ordered to new life can kind of come to feel sterile or pointless or selfish. Humanae Vitae said that contraception could reduce one spouse to an object of pleasure. And I think a hyper-focus on fertility can reduce one spouse to a means to having children. Also, this longing for our child written in our biology also occurs on the spiritual plane, right? We hear it expressed as the longing for the fruit of the flesh of my flesh, or for one made in our image, for love made incarnate as a person, for immortality. We know the real way in which all those longings are satisfied, right, in the person of Jesus Christ. But this longing in the context of marriage is satisfied in a concrete way in a biological child. So to not experience the gift of that child, that the existence of which explains the whole purpose of marriage in many ways, is to sort of feel cheated of one of the chief goods of marriage. And that can threaten within the couple to rob the marriage of meaning. And yet, it is in the church's teaching on marriage that my husband and I found the greatest consolation and hope, that our marriage, although infertile, is still intended to be fruitful. That teaching that the unitive and procreative meanings of marriage are inseparable means that conjugal love, expressed fully and faithfully, always carries with it both of its meanings. It is always unifying and fruitful, whether or not it results in a biological child. So rather than infertility being the occasion, which it is for many, of causing us to turn on each other or to turn inward in a kind of self-centered focus, we were given hope to discover the way in which God intended our marriage to bear fruit. That is the way in which our mutual love was intended to become embodied in another's good. So what might this look like? John Paul II suggested this: to couples who cannot have children of their own, I say, you are no less loved by God. Your love for each other is complete and fruitful when it is open to others, to the needs of the apostolate, to the needs of the poor, to the needs of orphans, to the needs of the world. Infertility in a marriage is indeed a share in the suffering of Christ, but it can be, and is intended to be, one that bears fruit in the kingdom of God. So here I'd just like to offer a few words about the experience of motherhood through adoption, which is the specific vocation that my husband and I discerned in our marriage, and I mean this with all sincerity. I give thanks for the cross of infertility, because it was the way in which our marriage was, that God intended for our marriage to bear fruit. I describe it as our labor, right? Every child comes into a family through labor, and this was ours. The experience of adoptive families is a sort of sign or witness, because I think it highlights the various realities of motherhood or of parenthood generally, but in a very particular way that makes it sort of a sign or a witness. So, for example, adoption disabuses all of us of the notion that a child is something we have or we get or we own, right? This child is object. All children are gifts, but adoption captures this in a really distinct way, because there is no literal act of co-creation biologically of the child. The child received is pure gift, who God, through the birth parents, has placed in your care for the time being. Another way in which adoption is a sign is that it reminds us, as Dr. Schindler pointed out, that motherhood is not simply a natural consequence of biology, in the sense that adoptive parents, they exercise their parenthood in an authentic way, even though they do not conceive and carry the child. Because whenever the church talks about procreation, she never stops with describing the birth of the child. She always goes on to talk about the upbringing of children. So, for example, the Catechism states that the fruitfulness of conjugal love extends to the fruits of the moral, spiritual, and supernatural life that parents hand on to their children by education. So in a real way, then, the 4 children that my husband and I have been entrusted with through adoption to call sons and daughter, and for who we are responsible to form and educate, in a real way, they are the fruit of our marriage. Another point is that adoption reminds us that all motherhood is sacrificial. Adoptive parents are no different from biological parents in the way that they lay down their lives for their children, but here I want to especially acknowledge the motherhood of the woman who places her child for adoption. Sadly, by a ratio of 50 to 1, most women prefer abortion to adoption. So studies indicate that women in crisis pregnancies view adoption as the least desirable option, often stating there are many reasons for this, but one reason is that they fear others will think that this choice is unnatural or heartless or abandoning their child. And I think what I want to honor here is that far from being a selfish or heartless choice, adoption is a sacrificial act of motherhood. It's being a good mother. The mother who chooses adoption does not abandon her child. First, she gives her child life in an age in which just this choice alone is a heroic virtue. And second, she gives her child the gift of parents or a family, something that perhaps she cannot, or for whatever reason, give to her child. And by actively choosing the good for her child over and above her own natural desires and needs, she gives a powerful example of motherhood, of sacrificial love. I'm always reminded here of the judgment of Solomon and the way in which he recognized the real mother was the one who was willing to sacrifice herself for the life of her child. So the experience of adoption witnesses to the self-sacrificial nature that all motherhood requires. One last reflection on the beauty of the adoption experience. A couple years ago during Lent, I found myself reflecting on an image of the crucified Christ. And it was this moment with Mary and John at the foot of the cross. And in this particular image, Jesus was leaning forward from his cross toward Mary, who was standing in a receptive posture with her arms and her hands open. And John was standing next to her with his head bowed reverently. And we know this is the moment from Scripture when Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son," and then to John, "Behold your mother." And this is the symbolic moment we know that Jesus gave Mary to all of us, to all of humanity, as our mother. But this supernatural gift was what Pope Benedict XVI called an entirely human gesture on the part of the dying Savior. One of Jesus' final acts was an adoption arrangement in which he placed his mother in the custody of the disciple who was especially close to him. And so a new home is also given to the disciple, a mother to care for him and a mother for him to look after. St. John Paul II once called an adoption an exchange of gifts, and this gift of motherhood and sonship at the foot of the cross, I think, beautifully demonstrates how all of those in adoption can be knitted together by this sacrificial act of self-gift and love. In closing, I want to witness to the gift of fruitfulness that we receive in marriage, and I want to affirm that infertility, although very painful, is not a barrier to this fruitfulness. As I said, conjugal love expressed fully and faithfully is unifying and fruitful. And just one last thing is that I want to put all of what I've said in perspective, which is this, and that is to say, all of us suffer, right? Infertility may not be your experience, miscarriage, et cetera, may not be your experience, but you will suffer. You will be asked to carry some particular cross. As Jesus tells us all, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And infertility is simply one type of suffering. But I think it helps us to see in a particular way that human suffering is meant to bear fruit. The paradox of the barren bearing fruit is the story of salvation. The most fruitful act in human history is Christ's death on the cross. So far from being discouraging, this should give hope, not just to infertile couples, but to all of us who seek to find meaning in the crosses that we're asked to carry. Thank you.
And I'm so grateful for all that's already been said. Hopefully I can add something to what's already been a really rich panel. I want to start with a quote by a pediatrician and psychoanalyst, D.W. Winnicott, and I'm going to follow his thought a little bit in my remarks. He was a great observer of mothers and their small children, and he spoke often to mothers. And once in speaking to mothers, he said this: "The baby does not know that the space around is maintained by you. How careful you are that the world shall not impinge before the infant has found it. By a living and breathing quietness, you follow the life in the infant with the life in yourself, and you wait for the gestures that come from the infant, gestures that lead to your being discovered." Dr. Schindler already mentioned Hans Urs von Balthasar, and I'm going to share again the quote that she mentioned of his. He wrote about the gaze between the smiling mother and the young infant, and he said that in that encounter, the horizon of all unlimited being opens itself for him, revealing 4 things to him: that he is one in love with the mother, even being other than the mother. Therefore, all being is one. That love is good, therefore, all being is good. That love is true, therefore, all being is true. That love evokes joy, therefore, all being is beautiful. It is maternal love and the special environment created by that love that allows the child to discover her, the mother, right? And through her being in its unity, goodness, truth, and beauty. And within those early interactions, to discover himself, a unique being possessed of those same 4 qualities. Now, while a mother's smiling gaze introduces her child to the nature of being, she is not pure being, right? But a finite and fallen creature with her own weaknesses, limits, and insecurities. The prospect of becoming a mother then can stir up great fear and trepidation. Mothering is all at once one of the most ordinary of tasks, right? And among the most extraordinary, crucial as it is for the person and for society. So in the few minutes I have today, I want to convey a couple things. One is a bit about what mothers ordinarily do in loving their children, especially their very young children, because it's especially at the beginning of life that the maternal function is so crucial. Fathers become more important later in the developmental trajectory. And then I want to take up a little bit about the fears of mothering that some of you may experience. Some of you already are mothers, but that can be quite scary as well. Okay, so first, a little bit on what Dr. Winnicott said about the ordinary devoted mother. He gave a series of radio broadcasts, actually, on the BBC in the 1950s. You can listen to snippets of them. You can find them online. They're lovely. What is it that the ordinary devoted mother does for her young child? Well, from the beginning, she holds her infant, and she creates a holding environment. You know, I actually thought when I heard the singing before our panel, I thought this is maternal. It's like holding. There's something about the singing that was like a holding environment. So Winnicott said, holding, and this is a quote, protects from physiological insult, takes into account the infant's skin sensitivities, touch, temperature, auditory sensitivity, visual sensitivity, sensitivity to falling, and of the infant's lack of knowledge of the existence of anything other than the self. It includes the whole routine of care throughout the day and night, and it is not the same with any two infants because it is part of the infant, and no two infants are alike. Also, it follows the minute day-to-day changes belonging to the infant's growth and development, both physical and psychological. I want to make a few observations about what he's saying here. It's so simple, holding in a way, but also so rich and so complex. First, holding involves the whole infant. In the early weeks of life, the baby's physical and psychological needs are very close, indistinguishable even. Maternal holding is very physical, right? It's a non-verbal mode of communication between mother and child, in which the whole complex of his needs and sensitivities are taken up. The second thing is that in general, a mother creates a holding environment for her child quite unself-consciously and naturally, right? She kind of just knows how to do it, as long as she herself has had this kind of experience of being held. Third, when good enough care, good enough mothering, that's another Winnicottian phrase, is provided, it's not generic, but it's specific to this child, attuned and responsive to this one. So patterns of mother-child interaction can be observed and described scientifically, and there's wonderful work that's been done on that, right? But there's a unique relationship between each mother and infant, so no one knows this infant like his mother. Furthermore, technical correctness and perfection are not the aim. But as I said, good enough mothering, where misses and ruptures occur but are mended before too long. In fact, all this, the misses and the ruptures, the disappointments, actually help the child learn not only to trust, but to bear disappointments and hurts. Fourth, holding is developmentally attuned. The infant is totally dependent on mothering, right? I mean, this is a very dramatic thing to face. I see a nodding face, maybe one of the mothers in the crowd, right? That the little infant is totally dependent on maternal care. Winnicott famously said, there's no such thing as an infant. There's no such thing as an infant, only an infant and a mother. They're a pair, they're a unity. You can't conceive of an infant alone, right? Over time, though, mothers will need to shift, allowing the child's differentiation and exploration as he develops his own capacities. And this actually involves a lot of losses. Every separation will involve a kind of loss for a mother. Now, this brings me to just a couple notes on fathers. I want to just say a couple things about fathers who seem to be entirely excluded from this picture so far. So the father, first of all, helps to create a secure environment for the mother. The father creates the holding environment for the mother, right? That allows her to focus intensely on her newborn child. His direct care, in the life of the infant, the father's direct care is a participation in the maternal function. His paternal care becomes crucial later on, right? For example, in facilitating a distinctive sense of self and separating from mom and learning about limits and boundaries. Hers is the more imminent task, and his is the transcendent, okay? So what does this kind of maternal care provide for a child? I want to mention two foundational things here. First, the young child gains an internal sense of what Winnicott calls a continuity of being. A continuity of being, a sense of having a personal and unique existence, of being alive, not just physically, but psychically and emotionally. He said if maternal care is not good enough, then the infant does not really come into existence. Now, he's not speaking objectively, the infant is there, right, but subjectively. So if this doesn't happen, the personality becomes built on the basis of reactions to emotional impingement. So the child feels that he needs to defend himself, and this becomes the basis of his personality without maternal care. So we could say that maternal care provides the foundation of the whole personality of the child. He gains awareness of his inner world and feels both secure and alive in himself. A second and related fruit of good enough mothering is the development of a secure attachment bond. And here the work of John Bowlby is very important. Through her attuned and contingent communication with the child, a mother becomes the first attachment figure. She becomes first a secure base from which her little one can explore the world. So just think about a toddler. I mean, if a mother were here with her toddler and he started to walk around, you would reference her, look back at her from time to time, right? But if he lost view of her, he would become upset. He can explore the world as long as she's there, right? And he knows that she's there. So her presence makes it safe to explore and learn about the world, right? And we heard so beautifully about how the family creates a way for children to learn about the world from Dr. Schindler. She's also a safe haven when he's distressed or afraid. She comforts and soothes him before he is able to soothe his own strong feelings. So if while exploring that new place, right, something were to fall and startle him or he were to fall down, what would he do? He would reach out for his mother or run back to her. And even as he gets bigger, he knows that if he has those young, distressed, vulnerable feelings, again, she'll be there, right? So sometimes a mother knows that a kindergartner, for example, might need to be held like a baby from time to time, right? And all of us, even into adulthood, need emotionally to be held from time to time. Attachment and dependency needs change, but they don't go away. We always have them. So through early maternal care, the child gains a sense of himself, both as an agent who can take action and explore the world, and as a dependent creature who is safe in the arms of another. He comes to expect that he'll be cared for, that others and the ultimate other will provide for him. So let's turn now to fears of becoming a mother. First, I want to just give a brief sketch of what motherhood asks of a woman, some of which I've touched on and have been touched on by others in the panel. First, it asks that she offer her body as another person's first home. Her own bodily boundaries and sense of herself shift to include a new little person. She doesn't give him life or sustain him in being. She's not in control, but she's tasked with providing the environment in which he can grow. And once he's born, he has his own movements in the world, right? At every stage of development, she experiences a loss precisely as he grows into his own personality and develops his capacities. So he leaves her body. He weans from the breast. He crawls or takes his first steps. He goes away to school, if he goes away to school, or leaves the home to go to college or to go off to pursue his own life. He who was and still is a part of her in a way moves away from her. Both the closeness and the intensity of the demands on one side and the separations and losses on the other can inspire our fear and trepidation. And depending on our own attachment histories, one or the other pole can seem more threatening. So on the one side, we can feel the threat of being taken over by the demands of the child, right? And on the other, we can be frightened by all the losses and the separations, right? They're both can be pretty scary, but some of us may be more frightened by one or by the other. Some of you may have doubts about your own capacity to mother, right? Perhaps you feel that you lacked good enough mothering yourselves. And you fear passing along your own kind of insecurities or fears onto your child. In a book called Parenting from the Inside Out, which draws on an attachment perspective, Siegel and Hartzell note that the best predictor of a child's security of attachment to a caregiver is the way that the adult has made sense of his or her own childhood experiences. So it's not simply how difficult one's childhood was, but the process of making sense of those experiences. So having had insecure early attachments doesn't need to keep you or anyone from being a good enough mother, actually. With a person who is an emotional secure base, it becomes possible to make sense of your own childhood history and your own inner experiences. For some, this might be the work of therapy, you know? You can gain attachment security in adult relationships, right? We call this earned security. And I think what Dr. Schindler said actually about marriage really applies here, right? Spouses are attachment figures for each other and can provide those kinds of corrective experiences. For a variety of reasons, not only personal, but also cultural, you might fear that you just won't know what to do with your child. In the technocratic age in which we live, many come to believe that they have to read all the books on parenting to learn every strategy for sleep, feeding, discipline, and there are lots of books to read, okay? To judge what's the best approach for every kind of parenting issue, let's say. But it's not instruction or even learning that makes a mother able to fulfill her task. If she has received what she needs, she knows. Now, I'm not disparaging good scientific advice or strategies. I'm in the mental health field. I give lots of advice and things like that. But none of this can replace what a mother knows naturally. Winnicott said, only if you can keep what is natural in you is it safe for you to learn anything that doctors and nurses can teach you. My own mother said she was very grateful that she raised her children before there was so much advice. It just allowed her to kind of rely on her natural intuitions. And I'll end here with another quote by Winnicott along these lines. He said, "The mother's adaptation to the baby's needs is a matter that is highly complex and difficult to describe in words. And it can only be done well or well enough by a mother who has temporarily given herself over to the care of her baby. It cannot be done by trying hard or by a study of books. It belongs to the special state that most mothers find themselves in at the end of their 9 months term, a state in which they are naturally orientated to the central thing, the baby." Thank you.